Okay, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, anyone who is watching this, and welcome to another Polar Educators International online event. This time we're being introduced to Antarctic glaciers, and we want to wish you all a happy Antarctica Day 2021. I am going to introduce our speakers, but just briefly, I'm Sophie Weeks. I'm one of the Vice Presidents of Polar Educators International, and I'm really happy to introduce Bethan Davies and her colleague Laura Boyall to introduce us to StoryMaps today. Bethan, over to you.
Hello everybody from wherever you're listening from. So my name is Bethan Davies and I'm a lecturer in physical geography at Royal Holloway, University of London. So I'm a glaciologist and I study glaciers and ice sheets in Antarctica and glaciers all around the world. And this is a picture of me in Antarctica doing some field work. Okay.
Laura, would you like to?
Hi, I'm Laura Boyall. I'm a PhD student at Royal Holloway, University of London. I study paleoclimate modelling, so looking at the past to inform our present and future understanding of the climate system. And I've also got an interest in policy and science communication. So recently I've been working on a series of educational interactive activities for students on Antarctica.
Take it away, Bethan. Yeah.
Yeah, we can tell you a little bit about the StoryMaps project. So shall I share my screen for this? So I can share the screen. So hopefully you can see my screen. So I set up Antarctic Glaciers back in 2012. And it's attracted funding from various different charitable organizations. And the website has a clear goal, which is to communicate the science of climate change, glaciology, Antarctica to the general public. And we have a particular interest in working with teachers and school children to try and get science into schools. So whilst we're interested in people who might have maybe watched a documentary on glaciers and climate change and might be interested in that, or they've read a news article, we're also interested in matching the curriculum. And it's been recognised in a few different places. So the Geological Association awarded us a Certificate of Excellence last year. And I was recently awarded a medal from the British Society of Geomorphology, the Gordon Warwick Award, and that the citation included the reference to the Antarctic Glaciers website. We've received on average maybe 70,000 page views per month from about 40,000 visitors, and we've had nearly creeping up to nearly 4 million page views since I launched back in 2012, so nearly 10 years ago. We were very generously funded by a number of different charities, including the International Association of Sedimentologists and the Antarctic Science Bursary. And the Antarctic Science Bursary specifically was to fund a series of story maps, which is where Laura came in, and Laura and I collaborated on this story map project for a year. And so Laura was building these story maps. So let's go on and talk about these story maps. Okay, so there were 4 story maps that we produced. We have one on the introduction to the physical geography of Antarctica, one on the wildlife of Antarctica, one on Antarctica and climate change, and one on people in Antarctica. And these were all targeting the UK curriculum because that focuses on the Antarctic biome in the what we call key stage 3. So this is kind of 11 to 14 years. So there is a need for people to learn this in pretty much every school in the UK, as well as other schools in all sorts of other different countries who also have similar curriculum. We did a lot of research into what teachers actually needed and wanted. We worked with pedagogical consultants and teachers. We held interviews. We worked with a lot of different educational experts to think about how best to design something that was useful to teachers. We were keen to produce something that could be used in the classroom. We were also doing this through the height of the pandemic, I think right through several lockdowns. Am I correct, Laura? Right through the worst of the lockdowns.
Yeah.
So we were also thinking about home learning and how people could use these at home without needing any kind of special resources and special needs. Laura, do you want to tell us about some of the story maps that you built?
Yeah, of course. So like Bethan said, they're divided into 4 different story maps, story map collections. And so we've got 18 individual story maps. Now each story map leads on from the following one, and they are also supplemented as well with a web page on the Antarctic Glaciers website, which is specific for teachers to have a bit more of extra information. All of the story map collections come also with a scheme of work, which essentially just helps teachers or educators basically use these story maps within a lesson. So each one should technically take around 50 minutes, but again, they're very adaptable, so teachers can use them as they wish. I'll briefly give an overview about the different story maps. The introduction to the physical geography of Antarctica provided an overview about the unique conditions of Antarctica, for example, the change in the seasons, the polar night. We've also got a lot of the different icy features. So we talk about ice shelves and sea ice and what the difference between a glacier and an ice sheet is. And we can use these to explore different parts of Antarctica. So we had very interactive maps of different sizes of ice shelves, and also infographics where we compared Arctic sea ice to Antarctic sea ice. So students could really get involved with that and see how how both of these sea ice things have changed over the course of the last 30 to 40 years. We also had a look at the wildlife of Antarctica in another story map collection. We focused on the emperor penguin. We used interactive GIS maps to have a look at their distribution. We looked at how they are a key marker in the Antarctic food chain. And we also looked at how penguins themselves can be located from space using their penguin guano, which is essentially their penguin poo. Also, we've got the 3rd Antarctic story map collection, which is climate change in Antarctica. We introduced students to different aspects of climate change using interactive climate graphs. So we introduced what carbon dioxide means for climate change, what temperature, how sea levels have changed over the past, say, 1,000 years. And then we also went on to look at how Antarctica has changed in the past, the present, and how it is predicted to change in the future. So you can look thousands and thousands and thousands of years into the past by using some of the Antarctic ice cores. So we had a look at how they can be used. We looked at how Antarctica is changing today with a change in ocean circulation and with increasing temperatures. And then we looked at how this has implications on future sea level rise around the globe. The final story map collection was the people on Antarctica. This is probably one that we're most proud of. It's something that we spent a lot of time on, making sure that we encapsulated lots of different minorities in Antarctica. So we focused on aspects of Antarctica which aren't typically heard of in the current literature. So we looked at how the discovery of Antarctica, but from a different perspective. We looked at the first women that came to Antarctica, or the Maori communities from New Zealand. So we really delved into lots of other aspects which aren't really covered typically. So yeah, that's a bit of the summary.
We need to reference here at this point, I think, the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, who really helped us to uncover these hidden archives and tell these untold stories to people who might, you know, reading Apsey Cherard or Scott of the Antarctic might not think Antarctica's for them, but then you see, well, women have been going to Antarctica since, when was the first woman in Antarctica, Laura?
Believe recorded is about I believe it's 1766.
Yeah. So you all think, oh, no women in Antarctica to what, 1980 or something, but no, they've been going there for centuries. So this is, I bet people don't know this. So we're really pleased to and excited to tell this story, tell the story of people of colour in Antarctica, first Black people in Antarctica, which was in 1940, first Black woman to get to the South Pole, and to highlight also Polar Pride. And we have a whole section on Polar Pride and what that means and how it's celebrated in Antarctica. So we're really excited to kind of tell these stories that are very different to kind of the fairly macho image that people might have of Antarctica, which might put people off from thinking about Antarctica or being interested in Antarctica if they can see more people perhaps like them. So when we were developing this, we were very keen to do this systematically. We didn't just want to dive in and start building story maps. We wanted to be very clear about what we were doing and why. And I think it was really important to do that we understood how they were going to be used in the classroom. I'm an academic. I teach in a very academic style to university students, and I've never been a teacher to 14-year-olds in a school classroom. So we needed to speak to the pedagogical experts who were doing this in order to understand how this kind of resource might be used. And they gave us some ideas about what kinds of things we should be thinking about. So yes, it needs to be 50 minutes, it needs to be interactive, there need to be questions that they need to be answering. But also, what don't they understand? What do they find hard? And what the teachers were saying were things like, there is resources around, but the language is too difficult. The children can't read it. We have to rewrite it. It's too hard. So it's really important that you have to find the right level of the language, and it needs to come with a lesson plan. The other thing that people were very clear about was that teachers are very busy people, and if you want teachers to use your work, you need to be very clear about how it fits to the curriculum. So we need to provide and how it would fit into the lesson. So Laura developed a whole series of schemes of work so that teachers could immediately see how to apply this in the classroom and exactly where it fits the curriculum. So that should hopefully help with lesson planning and help ensure that they're useful. Do you have anything to add, Laura?
I don't think so. I think everything's covered. Yeah, like Bethan said, we've really fit the scheme of work to the curriculum. So we've made sure that each section of the curriculum is completely covered with either one or multiple of the story maps.
Yeah. The teachers was telling us very specific things. We want data sets to analyze. We need to integrate GIS, but we're not, some people haven't been trained in GIS, particularly any teachers who did their degree kind of 20 years ago. They wouldn't have studied GIS in the university probably. So and even today, not all students do. So the teachers they were like, we need to deliver GIS, but we need support to do so. So we're trying to integrate the GIS, and the story maps are a really good way of doing that.
Just want to explain GIS to people who don't know the acronym.
Of course. A GIS is a geographic information system. It's mapping software, and it's a key part of geography. So it's about making maps. It's about taking the coordinates of the world and manipulating them to find certain features. And that GIS is embedded throughout our story map collection. So the students can find penguin colonies by their guano. They manipulate a globe to find Antarctica. They measure ice shelves, so they're measuring in kilometers. They're manipulating the map to measure things in there. There are in the story map on people, there are maps with the different people, timelines of different people and where they came from. You can click on a story that clicks you through, tells you on a tour around the world with different impacts of sea level rise and things like that. So this GIS is embedded throughout the thing. So the students are interacting with maps, working with maps, understanding maps, working with distance, measuring, calculating. These are all things that our younger audience are learning to do, and we are hopefully meeting that need in this workshop. Quite often, if you are funded to produce some sort of outreach project, you have to measure success in some way. It doesn't really matter what funding stream you use, but they will always want to measure success. They want to know exactly what you've done with the funding and whether it's been successful. So I think it's important to think about how we can measure success, but that can be very difficult when you're making a free website. You can't track necessarily downloads, you can't necessarily see if a policy is being changed, you can't necessarily see, you don't necessarily speak to your end users. You might have survey groups, but you might not have speak to the teachers directly. So I was trying to come up with a number of different ways in which we can measure success. So one of those first things is about Google Analytics. So I can see incoming links and referrals. So for example, I can see that lots of schools are linking to Antarctic glaciers, as well as lots of universities, lots of newspaper articles and other websites. And we also did specific things. So Laura, do you want to tell us about the survey that you set up?
Yeah, of course. So we designed a survey in order to send out to teachers or anybody who have been using these story maps or plan to in the future. We asked them to go through the story maps and essentially see whether they are definitely useful for teachers, and if they had any comments, and whether they are going to be informative for students, and whether they're going to be essentially liked from students. And 100% of the answers suggested that yes, they are going to be useful for students. And we had lots of cool comments which suggested that they really liked the idea that we included activities throughout each of the story maps for student engagement. So we really got some good feedback from the survey. We've also since then had over 5,000 viewers to each of the story maps collectively. So that was really good as well. So that's something else we can measure from success.
And we've had emails as well, just emails from teachers saying thank you for doing this. So various other ways. And we've also had feedback from things like the Royal Geographical Society and the Geographical Association and other kinds of professional bodies. And I think we were invited to contribute an article to Teaching Magazine. So Laura and I and Jen, we wrote that together. Give schools lectures. Laura gave a podcast just the other day. So to children's podcast on Antarctica. So yeah, these kinds of invitations arise out of people finding the website and then getting in contact with us. So yeah, I think the key challenges, if you want to use story maps for public engagement, I think the key challenges are to understand the audience, like who is going to use this. Are you expecting somebody to just sit down and randomly click through your story map? They're probably not going to do that unless they have a reason to, unless they're particularly unusually interested. So key challenge is to think very critically about who you're writing this for and why. So if you're envisaging this to be read by 18-year-old A-level students or IB students or whatever, or if you're envisaging this being worked through by some form of frozen planet viewer, those are different audiences and you need to go about it very differently. So before you start writing a story map, I think it's really important that you actually critically think through, why are you doing this? Who is it for? And what do they actually need? What are they hoping to get out of this? What do they need? And you should speak to them. And I think it's important to take time for well thought through and impactful public engagement. And I think one of the really delightful things about the story maps for me has been seeing, Laura as a trainee, really developing into a high flying science communicator in her own right. You didn't have that much experience when you started, and look at you now. It's fantastic. And we have Holly now coming in as a mentee, and before Laura there were others as well. So we've got now a legacy of people who've gone through this kind of public engagement training. I think it all takes time. It all takes time, and this is a challenge that needs to be considered by people, and ideally by universities if they want people to undertake meaningful public engagement. It should be part of the workload model, which it currently is not. Funding of continuing projects is difficult. Everybody wants to fund the next new shiny thing, and getting funding of something that is already established and successful can be difficult. And obtaining, and there are often, NERC had NERC is our national funding body. They recently had a public engagement call, and it specifically said we won't fund continuing projects. And you think, why not? This is already proven to be doing a good job, and you should fund it. But anyway, and obtaining meaningful feedback, getting feedback from teachers is actually very challenging because they're so busy and they're not particularly motivated to spend time filling in surveys for you, because who is? So getting meaningful feedback and measuring success can be difficult. And I think if you want to engage with people, I think it's best to respect them for their time and fund them for their time. And so our pedagogical consultants, we were able to offer some kind of compensation for the time that they spent helping us, which was really useful. Do you have any thoughts about the challenges, Laura, other than like learning how to develop a story map?
No, I think understanding the audience is definitely important. What I learned whilst doing these story maps was that the average reading age of somebody in the UK is an 11-year-old. So I think ultimately, when in doubt, if creating something of an educational basis, is aim for an 11-year-old, and then you can always adapt it more. In these story maps as well, whilst we said that they are aimed at Key Stage 3, so 11 to 14, we've also provided some brief ideas of how we could change these, or teachers could change these for both a higher and lower audience. So I think, yeah, understanding the audience is definitely important, but if we try and aim for a particular, say 11-year-old, then, you know, it's easily adaptable. I think that's the main thing.
Okay, I think that's the end of our slides. I'll stop sharing.
Great. Before I put up our plug for the conference, I just want to say thank you, an enormous thank you to both of you for being here on this wintry evening in the UK. It's not so wintry in Arizona, where one of us on this call is. And also to say that I think many of the members of the PEI network are going to be fascinated and excited by what you said, and really recognise a lot in what you've said. For example, PEI actually is trying to tackle all the time this idea of connecting educators, the accurate science in the polar regions and the third pole, and communities, because the meaningfulness for an audience comes from the community part of that triangle. So in things that you've said today, just what struck me about community and what you were saying was this idea of mapping, which you may sound very simple, but in fact, of course, we know that maps can show many things in many, many layers. They're not just a physical representation, but they can have these additional layers. And I think it's a fantastic, really fantastic idea, not just to create them, but to allow to find a way that people can really explore them and make meaning out of, well, in this case, Antarctica in all its glory, and not just go away with a pretty picture of a penguin. And often,
yeah, it's all about the krill. Actually, we had,
yes,
very keen to tell
absolutely.
everyone this.
Well, that was yeah. I mean, I think I spoke to you about that off air, but I did have to look up what a quaternary scientist was. And for those of you who don't know, listening to this, Bethan not only goes backwards and forwards in time in terms of her study of the planet, but looks at the planet as a whole, with all its systems interacting. And that mention of krill, of course, is deeply important, because there they are, right at the bottom of everything, but holding the whole of that biome up. And we often say what happens in the poles happens to us all, but I think you're probably a perfect scientist to represent that and talk about why it's not something that many people get. So also, just another plug for your website. There's a really cool thing building GIFs out of Landsat images, or that you can, which is, I thought it's very exciting to allow ordinary mortals to the access of these maps that are being made all the time, and by the satellites that are whizzing around the planet, and then to begin to think about interpreting them. So that, just a little plug there for something I thought was very, very cool on your website. But there are so many things that I'd like you to talk more about. I mean, the last thing you mentioned was to do with funding and online resources. I mean, bearing in mind, not the whole world, not everyone in the world has access to going online, but creating them is very labor intensive and should be money intensive. And as you said, there seems to be very little support for keeping something going and actually updating it. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, given you've been doing this for 10 years now.
Yeah. Well, there are funding dry spells, and then there are times when we have funding, and we're very generously funded by the International Association of Sedimentologists at the moment, who've committed for 3 years of funding, and that gives us financial stability. That allows us to plan, it allows us to invest, and it allows us to develop trainees and to bring new people on to work on the website. And so that's fantastic. And the Antarctic Science Bursary funded the StoryMaps project, which has been a really exciting, probably my favorite project that I've worked on over the last few years. It's been fantastic. It's been really inspiring. So I think, but yeah, funding, it's just a fair, we're lucky to have received the IAS funding because they've been very generous, and that's taken a little bit of the pressure off. But I think it's just it's a fairly constant battle of small grants. It's a fairly constant battle of small pots of funding. I was always very clear that I wanted the website to be free, and I want it to also be ad free. So an alternative way of funding the website is to put adverts on the website. And people do occasionally contact me and say, how much for a website, how much for a web page, how much for an article, and they want to I get probably one of them a month, but I've chosen not to go down that route. But I suppose that is another way that the articles could be funded. I just didn't want to find myself compromised by not having control of the website.
Yeah. I mean, Laura, you also touched on Laura's journey, and that also fascinates me, because of course as educators we're interested in scientists who've become converted to communication. It's very difficult being on the education side of it and continuously having to say to scientists, please learn how to communicate, please think about communication, because there's a thirsty audience out here who want to engage in what you're doing. So I wonder if you want to say a little bit more about that journey from being taught how to be a scientist to the things you've learned along the way.
Of course. So during my master's, actually, it was a master's in quaternary science at Royal Holloway. Part of our techniques, our geographical techniques, essentially, is aspects of science communication. We really stress that actually science communication is critical. If we're not putting out our research there to wider audiences, then actually what are we doing essentially? Where is our research going? And actually, I think working through the masters on science communication and actually having this opportunity with Bethan, it's really kind of like opened my eyes into actually the role that we have as scientists. I'm actually, part of my PhD is looking into science policy and how we can, as scientists, best communicate our science to policymakers. Now, communicating to policymakers and communicating to an 11-year-old is obviously significantly different, but actually we can use some of the skills that we do learn in both. And I think it is one thing that I will stress to many of my fellow PhD students or staff around the department or anything, is the role of science communication and how we should all try and take some time to be able to do it.
It can be difficult to persuade some more advanced scientists who are more advanced in their careers to engage, but we have also found as educators that when that happens, often they come back to us and say, I think this is going to make my science better, because I've had to really think about how to communicate it, and in doing that I've thought more about it in itself and where the meaning lies. So that's really interesting to hear that journey. I wonder if Pia has got a question. Do you want to ask a question, Pia, of our two wonderful speakers, or I could carry on? I can carry on. Or you're on mute, my dear.
Yes, I just wondered, how long did it take you to develop these maps and this approach? Because it's definitely labor intensive, and each one really has a lot of information. And this is one question. And the other is, have you actually checked with teachers how they're going to, whether they're able within their various curricula to introduce and carry on the specific a subject. I'm just thinking about education in Italy, and we had.
Do you mean non-English speaking teachers?
No. I mean simply how to put them in the curriculum, because it's a curriculum which has, usually it's science. I mean, I don't know about Britain, but geography seems to be a subject that tends to be absorbed by other subjects in sort of high school. And that's something that is really regrettable, but unfortunately seems to be happening. It gets more into social science or attached to other subjects. So in Italy, for instance, geography has disappeared, in fact.
Shall we ask either Laura or Bethan? So in the data that you collected, I can see that you're also using sort of Google Analytics and things like that to get feedback. Is there enough granularity in the data to see whether you're reaching other curricula apart from the British Key Stage 3 curricula that you aimed at?
I mean, there's an international reach to the website. So the Antarctic Glaciers website gets hits from pretty much every country in the world, pretty much all the time. So I know that the website is used very internationally. The story maps in particular, Laura, do you know if can you see where people are coming from? Do you get the geographical location?
No, we don't. We don't get any geographical location or anything, but we have in our feedback heard from teachers who have used them from the US and also in different age groups as well. So not just Key Stage 3.
Yeah, and Key Stage 3, I mean, Antarctica is an important part of the geography curriculum in UK, Key Stage 3. So that's very much what they're targeting. But I'm aware that in different countries the situation is different, but I think there's enough science, analytics and data that this could be used in maths or physics or any other science, really. The wildlife one has a whole thing about ecosystems, which would be very applicable to anyone studying biology. So I think these are very applicable across the kind of science and the social sciences. The history of Antarctica exploration really hits that. So they're kind of meeting that need, I think, across quite a broad curriculum, beyond geography, I think, even though they're very maps focused, very much beyond geography. In terms of the time frame, they took a year. This was a year-long project, and Laura was juggling 2 jobs at the time. But we took a year to develop these.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that question. And I'm sure there will be more questions that come in, maybe through comments on the live stream. So we'll keep the comments open on the YouTube channel. Just if anyone wants to comment, we'll do our best to answer the questions. But I thought I would just finish maybe with a slightly soppy, but I'd like you to answer it scientifically too, a question about whether there's hope for our glaciers, because I guess one of the reasons many people are drawn to the polar regions now is sort of thinking about a warming climate, and ice won't stay ice as things get warmer. And we know bits and pieces about how the melting of glaciers may impact the globe. So I wonder, and it's a big tall order, both Bethan and Laura, but is there any hope for the glaciers, and or are we seeing them?
There is hope. There is hope, but it requires political will. It requires action, and it requires dramatic action, and it requires action now. The COP26 conference, the carbon, what are they called? The carbon contributions that the different countries, the different blocks negotiate, put us on a pathway of around 2 to 3 degrees centigrade warming, and we'll have lost 1/3 of the world's glacier ice by the year 2100 relative to 2015. So we're on track to lose a real substantial volume of ice, and to lose all of the ice in places where the glaciers are smaller, so places like Europe or the Himalaya, or places where the glaciers are not so substantial. Places like Alaska, which have very large ice fields, the ice will remain there for longer, and that would be pretty devastating for anyone who relies on these glaciers for water. They're a real part of our culture and our society. Go to any glaciarized nation, these glaciers, they're a really important part of their culture. People are very proud of them. In terms of Antarctica, Antarctica is projected to contribute around 10 millimeters to global sea level rise on pretty much most scenarios up to the year 2100. So Antarctica will persist, will remain, but where Antarctica is in 200 years' time or 300 years' time is very, very critically dependent on what we do now, like this week, because we don't have much carbon left. And if we continue to emit lots of carbon, then we will see dramatic losses of the world's glaciers in our lifetimes. And the loss of Antarctica, West Antarctica, the Antarctic Peninsula, the collapse of the ice shelves, certainly in our children's lifetimes or our grandchildren's lifetimes. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Laura.
I think you've done pretty good.
Yeah, there is hope, but it requires political will and it requires urgent action. It requires urgent action now. I mean, there are good signs. Just within the UK, for example, the amount of carbon produced in our energy transport nationally is falling dramatically. This is a really positive sign. We're moving towards greener transport. We're moving towards green cars, electric cars. But it's cheaper to fly to Scotland from London than it is to get the train, which is just wrong. It's just wrong. It should be cheaper to get the train. Trains are much more carbon neutral. This is simple things that the government could do.
Thank you. Sorry to end on an up and down note, but you said there was hope. So I think we've ended.
There is hope. We're moving in the right direction. We just need to move faster.
So we encourage anyone listening to love Antarctica even more by visiting the Antarctic Glaciers website and using some of those extremely cool resources. And if you don't mind, I'll just share my screen again and just give a little plug, if I can, to the conference that's coming up. Let me just find it again. I don't know if Betsy's still there. She's probably run away now.
I can share it if you want.
Oh yes, would you? It'll be slide number 4. Thank you, and sorry for that rather unprofessional delay there. Should have had it at my fingertips. But just to say thank you to Laura and Bethan for being with us here tonight, and to tell educators, polar educators everywhere, anyone who is passionate about ice, that we hope we're going to have an in-person conference next year in the extraordinary Hutton in Iceland. Still can't pronounce it. You have to fly to Reykjavik, and then we will take you on a tour of the south coast, the southeast coast of Iceland, through extraordinary features, enabling you to walk on ice for the first time in one of our biennial conferences, but also to visit the retreating glaciers on Iceland, and to learn from experts and school children about those glaciers. And then 2 days focusing on the human stories in ice, with a focus on the Arctic and Indigenous knowledge and people who live and work in the north, and also a good chunk of glaciology in there as well. We won't forget Antarctica, and we'll be covering the third pole. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, that would be high mountain glaciers, as Bethan mentioned, the Himalayas. So you're all welcome very soon to have a look at the website. It'll be live soon, 1st of tomorrow, actually, I hope, and register in person. We are also hoping, funding permitting, to be able to offer some things online as well, and to at least have a fallback position, because as we know, in this global pandemic and national pandemics, we don't know what's going to happen really, but we're hoping to connect. It will be a connection, not only educators from around the world, but also young scientists from around the world, and speakers from the north, from representation from Indigenous communities as well. And as you can see, more stories, ideas, swap, science labs, panel discussions, hands-on activities, good old chinwags, I don't know, around fire pits or whatever it is they do in Iceland, but we'd love to welcome you there. And on that note, a very last thank you to Bethan and Laura for being here, and we hope to all see you again soon, and happy Antarctica Day.